Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. My name is Galina Vroman. I am the author. The book is Hill of Secrets. I'm very pleased that it's been doing extremely well, much better than my expectation. It's #1 on new releases in historical fiction on Amazon. It's been out since October 1st, so so I don't know how much longer it'll be considered a new release, but I'm enjoying my 15 minutes in the sun while it lasts. So I just want to give you a very quick, first of all, how many people have actually read the book already? Because it changes a little bit how I talk about it. So most people have not, so that's fine.
Oh, someone in the back.
Somebody has? Okay. Are we okay? So just a quick summary of what it's about. The book is really, and let me ask you another question. How many of you have seen the movie Oppenheimer? Okay. So this is really about what the movie Oppenheimer is not about. The Oppenheimer really focuses on the science and the politics, and this really focuses on what life was like for the people who were brought along, essentially the wives and the children of the scientists who came to Los Alamos and had no idea why they were there, and no idea how long they were going to be there. They lived on what was essentially a military base that didn't feel entirely like a military base, except that their letters were censored. They could not leave. They could not go on vacation. They were allowed to go to Santa Fe to shop, but essentially they were stuck there. And it's kind of how, it was like suck it up and make do. And that is really what this book is about, is how those people who were brought there and they living in this uncertainty, how they coped, and the corrosive impact of secrets, because that's why it's called Hill of Secrets, because obviously the biggest secret in the room was the bomb that nobody could talk about. It was known as the gadget, and it had a Peyton Place kind of atmosphere about it. It started with a couple hundred people in 43. By 1945, there were 6,000 people living there. 2/3 of them were families. And so it was a community with all the things that a community has, for better and for worse. And that is really what this book is about. It's about the community of Los Alamos. And it basically follows 5 characters who are completely fictional, but do represent different portions of that population as they lived through those 2 years. So that's a quick summary of what the book is about. I think I would like to introduce Myra, who is a neighbor and an enthusiastic reader who's already read the book. So she got recruited to do Q&A with me, because it's just easier to talk off of somebody and have somebody ask you questions than make it all up as you go. I think what I would like to do is perhaps start by reading a little bit from the book so that you get a bit of a flavor of it, and then we'll explore it a bit further. So if I can find my... it looks like I really don't need the microphone, so that's good. This is the first part that I will read is really from when Christine, who's the main character, she was an art restorer in New York. She's an intelligent, college-educated woman, and she has just arrived with her husband, Thomas, at Los Alamos. Somebody's waiting. Somebody wants to come in? No, they ran away. Okay. They've just arrived at Los Alamos. They've just gone through the security, and now they are entering the heart of the base. And they've been picked up by Jimmy, who is a member of the Special Engineering Deployment that was at Los Alamos, and it turns out that somebody here in the audience, his father, was in that corps, and it's just like so exciting. He actually has pictures of his father like at Los Alamos. She's like, wow, so these are like real people. So Jimmy is just dropping off the scientist. First stop, Site Y, otherwise known as the tech area, Jimmy said. Off you go, Dr. Sharp. The officers in that booth there want to see your security pass again and will direct you to Opie's office. Opie is Oppenheimer. I'll make sure the missus is okay. He took a hand off the steering wheel to salute, then extended it to shake Thomas's hand. It's been a pleasure, sir. Thomas threw a glance back at Christine. You'll be okay? Sure, she smiled bravely. Will you know the way home? A good question, Thomas laughed. Don't worry, said Jimmy. Anyone can direct you to the Sun units. It's walking distance. And at the Suns, people will know your apartment. Only one unit was empty, and everybody's been waiting to see who gets it. Thomas hopped out of the car and stopped a moment at the back window to give Christine a peck on the cheek. He squeezed her hand. Wish me luck, he said. With a start, Christine realized that Thomas was nervous, intimidated even, something she had never seen before. Brilliant was the adjective normally used in conjunction with her husband. Although he was not arrogant, she knew he did not consider it inaccurate. I guess this is big, she said. She was still as baffled as she had been since those letters started arriving in New York as to why his expertise could be of such importance to the war effort. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, and he shrugged. I think it is. She realized suddenly that maybe even he didn't know exactly why he had been summoned here. Good luck. She squeezed his hand and let him go, proud to see him walk purposefully toward the security booth and into the inner sanctum of the exceptional, brought together to try and win this horrid war. Jimmy stepped on the gas, and Christine tried to memorize the route as they turned right, down one upward unpaved road, and left on another. All around, she saw construction sites and flimsy houses, scattered like a trail of shoeboxes, their fresh green paint and corrugated tin roofs already dusty. She had never noticed before that dust had a smell. She wondered if there were as many varieties of dust smell as there were of natural Maine mulch. Would she learn to discern them? Women with strollers struggled to push their charges through deep, rutted roads. Others trudged along, looking defeated by the heat, loaded down with net bags of groceries in each hand. They wore workman's boots, sneakers, or sandals. None wore pumps like hers. On a balcony, a cluster of women chatted, laughing over tea or coffee, and Christine was surprised at the flash of longing she felt. Could they be future friends? In her experience with small, remote places, chattiness was cattiness. What were the chances things would be different here? The sound of nails being pounded into clapboard created a sense of bustle and newness. It felt as if, when she awoke the next day, she might find herself in a town constructed overnight by leprechauns. There were telephone poles on the side of the road, but she noticed that no lines ran between them. Anyone have a phone in this place? She asked. Only the director, and only in his office, said Jimmy. The poles were put in place, but then the security guys decided it was better not to let folks have phones. Christine didn't like these security guys, whoever they were. Jimmy stopped in front of a two-story unit with small windows and front balconies bordered with slat wood balustrades. You're in the apartment upstairs, he said, opening the door of the Chevy for her. While she stared at the steep wooden stairs, Jimmy pulled out the suitcases, duffel bags, and packages from the trunk. He nodded to her to lead the way. But she let him go first. She was curious to see her new home, but as long as she stayed in the street, maybe she could still drive away to New York, to Samantha, to restoring antique furniture and old paintings, to new exhibits by upcoming artists, to Broadway plays and walks in Central Park. Jimmy made his way down and up with more luggage, sweat pouring from his brow. This time she followed him up the stairs. Standing on the landing balcony before the door of the apartment, she looked around at the tangle of children's bicycles in the lot between the buildings. The clotheslines across the way fluttered with T-shirts of every color and size. Another line displayed only diapers. Did everyone here have children? Sand scratched her throat. Let me get you some water, she said to Jimmy as he walked past her into the unit. She followed him in and headed into the sunny kitchen. After opening and shutting the white cabinets until she found glasses, Christine turned on the cold water tap at the sink. The water was warm, slightly brown. She let it run. Don't do that, said Jimmy. No wasting water. But it's brown. That water takes too long to run clear to waste it that way. You probably want to be boiling the water you drink until your body gets used to it. How long does it take a body to get used to the water, to this place? And so that gives you a sense of how it was to arrive there. The second part that I'm going to read is a few months later. They've already been there, and they're on their way to a party at Oppenheimer's home. And that was also a very, it's really, They worked very hard and they played very hard. A lot of the testimonies that I read really talk about how crazy these parties were. They were, they had a good time. As very often happens in a situation where there's a lot of tension, that you let it off when you can. And so that is really what happened. I'm just trying to get my pages here. Okay. Christine hooked her arm around Thomas's as they strode to the Oppenheimers' home. She would have liked to stroll leisurely and take in the cool evening air, but Thomas was walking quickly, glancing at his watch, and she struggled in her high-heeled pumps to keep up with him. Are we late? Who cares, he sighed. These parties are always the same. Everyone's pretending to get along. Too much alcohol. I already know I'll have a hangover tomorrow. Are you okay, she asked. You know I can't talk about things. Why are you pressing me? I just want to know how you're feeling. It's not easy to joke around and make nice with people that I've been arguing with all week over who gets the limited material we need. The leaves rustled in the large trees as they made their way along Bathtub Row, so named because its stone and log houses, built when Los Alamos was still a boys' boarding school, were the only homes on the hill with the luxury of bathtubs. Christine patted his arm. Maybe the party will help smooth things over. At the house, they exchanged nods with the 2 military guards at the entrance and let themselves in through the open door. So glad you've come. Opie loped towards them, gangly and graceful as a giraffe. Let me take your jacket. You're looking lovely this evening, Opie said, his intense eyes taking in Christine's off-the-shoulder satin dress. Why, thank you, she smiled. There were so few occasions to get dolled up. It was nice to have her efforts appreciated. Can I get you some drinks? One of my martinis, perhaps? Sure, Thomas said. Wouldn't miss one of your famous martinis for the world. Why don't you join the crowd singing with Owen? Opie gestured toward a young man playing a ukulele. He's with the Special Engineer Detachment, seems to know all the latest hits, so I invited him to play for us this evening. They made their way over to the group, nodding and smiling at the many people they knew. Owen was crooning a song Christine immediately recognized as the Mills Brothers' latest hit, Paper Doll. She leaned into Thomas and swayed to the music, wondering if her husband, like the crooner, wanted a paper doll instead of a real live woman. Once she had been sure he wanted a spirited, independent wife. As Thomas and others joined Owen in the song's refrain, she hoped he still did. Opie brought over their drinks, a martini in each hand. Christine took a sip. Thomas was right about the free-flowing alcohol. The drink had an overly generous amount of gin. She looked around the room at the wood beams elegantly embedded in the high white plaster walls and the well-stocked bookshelves. Her eyes wandered to the chimney and its mantel, decorated with a striking black vase. She stepped away from the group to take a closer look. Opie joined her. I see you appreciate beautiful things. She smiled at him. His fragile lankiness reminded her of the saints in medieval paintings. His penetrating eyes were like theirs, at once distant and comforting. I used to work as a restorer, painting, furniture, porcelain, that sort of thing. Really? He sucked her in with his gaze. The last project I worked with before we left New York were pointillist paintings. Seurat, Le Mans, if you know them. I do. Le Mans and Signac's landscapes have always struck me as fine. Personally, I prefer Signac over Seurat. Do you like pointillist art in particular? She had met Opie at numerous parties, but their exchanges had been no more than perfunctory before. Now she found his erudition and affable curiosity made talking to him surprisingly easy and pleasant. I'm fascinated by them. Actually, I wrote a long article for the catalog to a show in New York all about how pointillists deconstructed color to its most essential elements, influenced, of course, by advancements in science at the time, our understanding of atoms, the discovery of electrons, etc., etc. She ended with a laugh, afraid that she may have gone on too long. Never thought of pointillism that way. Very interesting. He seemed genuinely intrigued, ignoring the gleeful shrieks from across the room and the singing which had grown louder. I'd love to see that catalog. Unfortunately, the article never made it, arrived too late to be included, apparently delayed by the censors. And they censored so much it was unreadable. Imagine, an article about art. Opie combed her face with his eyes for a moment before answering. It can be hard to understand the censors, but sometimes they do make sense. His lips quivered as if he were trying to suppress a mischievous grin. She could tell that he had been a good professor, forcing students to think for themselves rather than immediately revealing what was to him an obvious answer. Then it struck him. You mean atoms, electrons, that's what bothered them? He didn't look at her and instead busied himself with taking down the vase from the mantel, deliberately inspecting it for a few moments. He held up the piece. I got this from Maria Martinez, a potter from San Ildefonso. Met her more than a decade ago when I lived there. It took Christine a moment to focus again on the pot. She was trying to absorb what Opie had said, actually not said, about her censored article. He was looking at her expectantly, obviously waiting for her to respond to the change in topic. You lived here? I was as sickly as a teenager. I always liked horseback riding. My parents sent me out here to recover from dysentery. The air here was good for me, and ever since, I came whenever I could just to ride and camp out. Christine tried to imagine the energetic man standing before her as sickly. When I was asked to find a remote place for a little project, naturally, I looked here. In a way, everyone in this room is here because of my dysentery. Opie laughed, then continued wistfully. I guess a part of me was hoping to relieve the magical past. He took a generous sip of his martini, and she took a small one of hers, unsure what to say. Just then, Kitty teetered up on high heels. She was as petite as Opie was tall. She nodded hello to Christine, her eyes sweeping her with suspicion before looking up at her husband and tossing her curly dark hair. I need your help getting Peter to sleep. She patted his arm possessively. Come on now. Come now. 2-year-olds. Opie smiled ruefully at Christine. He handed her the vase before going off with his wife, who grabbed his arm, unsteady on her feet. Christine was glad to be left on her own to marvel at the vase with its fine design, part matte, part shiny. As she gazed at it, she heard Enrico Fermi, a few feet away, animatedly explaining recent events in his native Italy to a few colleagues. And then it goes on with more of the party. So that gives you a sense of how I weave a little bit of the history in, and I will show you also some of the work of Maria Martinez, who has but I think we'll turn a little bit to some questions and continue from there. So. So, my dear.
Good evening. So bear with me. So how are you doing today?
I'm fine. I love this.
So good afternoon, everyone. We came up with these questions after I had read the book. And so I am going to proceed, and hopefully you will also have some questions that you may want to ask at the end of the Q&A. So, Lena, what prompted you to write this book? Especially one so far from your own experience.
Well, I spent about half my adult life in Israel, and you can't live in Israel without wondering about nuclear weapons and being concerned about them. So I've sort of been following nuclear policy forever, ever since I was a young adult. So that's something that always concerned me. And then in addition, I've always been intrigued by the whole nature of secrets. I think for those of us who are not that young, we have seen a trajectory in the way people handle delicate information about their lives. When I think in the 50s, 60s, you didn't hang your laundry out. You didn't talk about things. There was the big C. Certainly gays didn't reveal them. I mean, it was a whole different aura. And now we live in an age where, people photograph everything they eat, and tell you all kinds of stuff about themselves, which you may or may not want to know. And then there's you can do the genetic testing and find out about all these half-siblings that you didn't know you had. So we've gone kind of from one extreme to another, and that kind of fascinates me. And I'm not sure whether this is good or bad, and that's kind of one of the questions, I would say, of the book, is when are secrets corrosive, and when are they actually generous to keep things secret. And I thought that putting it in the background of the most secret place in America of the 20th century was just a nice juxtaposition. So that's why I did that, And so Los Alamos just seemed, it was a conversation with a historian who told me that he had a student who had interviewed wives of scientists at Los Alamos about what they knew or didn't know about the project, and I thought, wow, that's it. So that's how it all started.
So what were the biggest challenges in writing the book?
Well, basically writing it. It took me 12 years. I was doing a lot of other things in the meantime. I think also I'd never written a book. I had written quite a lot of short stories, and the nature of writing a novel, you need a kind of consistency. Like when you write a short story, you can focus it on a person, you can focus it on a scene, and you're in and out. You get your point across and you leave. When you write a novel, it has to have a kind of consistency in the pace. In other words, you can't describe the desert in great detail and then not describe the inside of a house. Just because the inside of a house is more boring, you have to make both of them equally interesting, and that's a real challenge. To kind of not have chapters that are only dialogue and then only description, and how do you balance those over 300 pages, not over 20 pages, but over 300 pages. And that, I think, was really difficult for me. I'd have to go back to a chapter and say, but I haven't described anything here. This is like all dialogue. Oh my God, I have to put in some, things happening around them. And so that was a lot of the rewriting, was going back and saying, oh, but here I'm going on to a description for 5 pages. Oh my God, I don't cut that down. So that was the real balancing act.
You come from a background of journalism. How different was it for you to write fiction compared to nonfiction?
Well, it's a lot of fun because you're God. You don't have to, like with nonfiction, you do have to stick to the facts. And if you can't source something, you're done. You can't use it, basically. And you may kind of know you're right, but if you can't prove it, then you can't write it, or you can't publish it. And here, if you kind of feel it, it's okay, go with it. And that was really nice. It was really, really fun to be able to not have to worry too much. Though that said, I was very, very concerned about historical accuracy. And I had some amazing copy editors. There's a part in the book where Christine looks at a painting, and there's a lot of thoughts about that painting. And the copy editor wrote to me, well, this painting is in the Metropolitan Museum, but they only acquired it in the 1960s. So she would not have seen it in 1943. On the other hand, Edward Hopper did have an exhibit at the Metropolitan that year, and maybe you could use one of his scenic paintings instead of Cézanne, and here is a possible substitute. And it was, whoa. I ended up using the Cézanne because I wanted the Cézanne, but then I had to kind of explain it in the historical notes. So there was also a lot of the songs. The editor would say, yes, this song did exist then, but it's not sung by the group that you have seen. I mean, so there was a lot of, the one that I won, though, was when I had some description of the morning light looking like skim milk flooding into the room. And she said, well, skim milk was just animal feed at the time, and nobody would have known what skim milk really was. And I found an advertisement from 1944 for powdered skim milk, and I said, I think we can leave the skim milk in. So this was so there was a lot of attention to historical detail. I still got a couple of things wrong. I got one review, somebody gave me a 1-star review because I said something about somebody spraying starch on a shirt before ironing, and they said spray starch didn't exist then. But it did. It just wasn't aerosol spray. So there. But I didn't get into it. It's okay. So there is the whole fact-checking thing that is similar to journalism.
I did a little fact-checking myself when I was reading your book. But so how did you develop the characters? And were some of the characters harder to write than others? And why?
Well, I started with a theme, the idea of secrets and secrets in the big national context and secrets. And then at some point I realized, oh God, I've got to have a plot. So then I started developing the characters, thinking about, well, who was at Los Alamos? So it really was, you had the creme de la creme of American physics departments. So these were elite elite scientists from the best institutions, and then you had a lot of refugees from Europe who were living there. And so it was this combination. And then the more I read, you also had a lot of Latinos who were there, and quite a lot of Native Americans who were who did the grunge work. And so I sort of started putting all that together. And then I had to give, everybody a secret that they had to keep. And so slowly it evolved. I was in a writer's program that I had joined I'd gone into this MFA program to write the novel, and then in the first day they told us we had to submit. They would not allow us to workshop book chapters. We'd have to workshop short stories. So it all started as a series of short stories. It's a terrible way to write a novel, to start with a theme without a plot, to then do short stories interconnected. Only one short story survived in the book out of all of the ones that I wrote. But it was a way to get to know my characters. But that's also why it took 12 years. And in terms of the characters that are hardest to write are the ones that are least like you. So I have Jimmy, who's a member of the engineering detachment, and he has nothing in common with me. He comes from Cape Cod. He comes from a lower class, working class background. He's a guy, and so he was a real challenge to write about. But I love that, because otherwise it's like being typecast, as an actor. You don't want to just do what you know. You want to do what you don't know. So that part's fun.
The book is essentially plot and character driven, but to me it also had a political undertone. Do you think of it as a political book, or do you see it as relevant to politics today?
I do. I mean, it's a story, and it tries to be a story. At the same time, yes, given that that nuclear weapons worry me, and I think never more than now. I'd say since the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have never been closer to the deployment of nuclear weapons. I think I want to. Part of the book really does, in its way, without hitting people over the head and saying you need to be thinking about this, to sort of say, we need to be thoughtful about the use of nuclear weapons. These things are done in secret. They're done without our consent. If you compare the debates that went on about the use of nuclear civil energy, that went on for years, and communities got very involved in debating about it. When it comes to nuclear weaponry, nobody gets a say, and that's really scary, particularly now. And I think I did want to increase awareness of Americans of what was done in their name. There were no, the whole idea of crimes against humanity was not a developed concept at the time. And so I think that a certain awareness about how these things can avalanche into happening. Sometimes with deliberation and sometimes with insufficient deliberation. So in that sense, I think to the degree that I would like readers to go away with a lot of questions about politics, then yes, I think that it is a political book in that sense. But without my having the answers, the book takes on a little bit, should they have, shouldn't they have, dropped the bomb, but I don't try to answer the question. I really want to leave that to the reader. So.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask?
I do. I just thought about it. Knowing that you know a lot about history, is there a certain time of history that fascinates you more than others?
Well, I think World War II definitely does fascinate me, and the period immediately after it. I think the 1950s is also a very interesting period. The 1960s is the one that gets a lot more attention, but I think the 1950s was a hugely important period, especially for America, in its vision of itself, and sort of becoming its recognition of itself as a superpower, And so I think, and all that and huge changes in American life that were the result of the war in every way. So I think that period.
Have you written a book set in the 1950s?
No, but I've been asked to do a sequel, so we'll see.
Yeah. Did you ever get a chance to visit Los Alamos?
I did. I spent about a week there, wandering around, scribbling. I was in the summer. I would have liked to go in the winter to get a sense of the different sense of it. And the description of Bathtub Row exists and still standing. And so a lot of the buildings are there. And I describe in the book a lot about the different clubs that, they had barbershop quartet and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of that is documented there. They have a very, very nice exhibit. So, and it's still a research area. So, yeah.
I was just wondering how you weaved in, like you got your facts of the historically, and then you weaved in a story, right?
Right.
So I'm just wondering how that all.
Well, the thing, doing the research is really fun, and then it's like, well, I've got to stop doing this research. I'm supposed to be writing a book, and so you try and. It's a dance, because sometimes you want the facts are so interesting, you want to impose them on the story, and you kind of have to stop yourself. So I actually, when I asked Andy when he was showing me the pictures of the here his father is with a dog. Okay. Now, one of the things that happened in Los Alamos was there was a dog got rabies, and the commander of the post wanted to exterminate all the dogs on the site. And there was an actual revolt of the residents who said, if the dog goes, I go. And I was desperate to put that in the book. I really wanted to put that in the book. Such a great incident. But I couldn't fit it in. Or Edward Teller did a story hour for children. Okay, every Sunday he did a story hour for children, and so I wanted to put that in. That's like, so like this Hungarian physicist who created the hydrogen bomb did a children's story program. I couldn't. I wrote the scene, and then it just slowed down the story. So you sort of have to say, too bad, out it goes. And there was also there was some kind of town council that did various, would go to the military and say, can we have more of this? Can we have less of that? And that also was in there at one point. And basically I tried to combine it with the dogs and I had to let it go. So I think there's always this dance between wanting to put stuff in and having to say, wait a minute, there's a story here. I got to tell the story and not get distracted. So that's how it goes. Yeah.
What did you use? How did you access primary sources? Like, did you go to Library of Congress? Is there a museum at Los Alamos? So it's like one part of the question. The second is, people used language differently during the war and had different phrasing and, of course, dressed differently. And did that all come from your imagination, or did you have,
Google. I don't know how people wrote historical fiction before Google, but
but you couldn't, could you use Wikipedia? Was that factual enough?
No, but there are whole lists of slang words from the pick a decade, and you'll get a whole list of slang words from that decade. So everything that how did you say a girl? How did you talk about how did you talk about breasts in the 1940s? Anything you could find it. You can pretty much find these lists. So that for the clothing, I looked at old catalogs, Sears Roebuck catalogs. You can get them from the 40s. So that was, and then there's a very extensive oral archive at Los Alamos. A lot of this was also during COVID that I was writing this, so I couldn't. So there were some places that were closed, but the online oral histories and you could just do children. So you could just look at oral histories of people who were children at Los Alamos, or people who were maids at Los Alamos, or people. So I just listened to all those things. And for example, the pot that I mentioned in the thing, and I do want to take a moment to show a few slides. It turns out, so I have this pot in the story, right? And it's part of the plot. And then I came across a maid who was the niece of Maria Martinez, who cleaned Oppenheimer's house. And she talked about how she loved to go to the house to clean their house because she would see her aunt's pot there. I said, yes, he did have a pot. And I was like, so that's also the part about like where you don't have the exact facts, but you can go with your feelings, and then sometimes they're actually verified. I will take a moment and show some of the characters that are mentioned in that part that I wrote about the party. So this is, you can hit the lights for a moment. This is Maria Martinez, who was a potter. She was actually already famous by the 1940s. So this is where I sort of changed history and made her become famous through, she meets Christine eventually, and but she was a real figure. And this is some of her pottery, so that you can have a sense of how really gorgeous it was. And the amazing thing is, when I did a presentation about the book in Monterey, it turns out that a neighbor of mine actually had one of her pots, because her father had taught at the Los Alamos school before it was requisitioned by the Army, and he had bought one. So it was like, oh my God, she read the manuscript. I'd asked her to read the manuscript. She returned the manuscript with the pot to show me. So this is a little bit, again, an example of her work, which if you read the book, it's very much referenced, the images. And this is a picture of Oppenheimer. For those of you who saw the movie, I had a lot of problems with the movie, mostly because he's not a very charming, pleasant guy in the movie. And most of the descriptions of him are that he really was a very, very charming, amiable sort of guy. People liked him. Women particularly, he really charmed women. And that he was not sort of cold and distant. And so I think I picked this picture because I think you get a real sense of that. This is his wife, Kitty, who did have dark hair the way I described her. In other parts of the book, I mentioned Richard Feynman, who was a young up-and-coming artist, scientist at the time. And this is Enrico Fermi and his wife, Laura. Laura wrote a memoir called Adams and the Family, of her time in Los Alamos, which was a very important source of information for me. And this is actually Maria Martinez at Los Alamos at a party with Enrico Fermi. They actually socialized. The Pueblo Indians came and Native Americans came and danced and showed off. They did, the residents at Los Alamos taught them square dancing, and the Native Americans showed their dances. So it really, it was a very, I just sort of, wanted people to get a sense. And again, my book doesn't focus on these people, but it's really part of the scenery as much as the desert is, or as much as the buildings are. So, any other questions?
I was going to ask Alan.
Sure.
Alan's father worked
Right.
with Oppenheimer.
Right.
Did your father say anything about him in any of the literature?
And here he just gave me coming in here this thing of from the newspaper of the clipping of when the Hiroshima was.
Which newspaper is that?
That's from Newark, right? It's the Newark Evening News. And it's all it's UPI copy.
What's the date on that, Galene?
The date is August 8th, and August 6th was when the first bomb was, and then August 8th. By the time this came out, actually, Nagasaki would have been the next. So and the other thing that he showed me, if I have it, no, I didn't take that, was a letter from Oppenheimer thanking his father for his service. This is from Truman to Sidney Metzger. To you who answered the call of your country and served in its armed forces to bring about the total defeat of the enemy, I extend the heartfelt thanks of a grateful nation. As one of the nation's finest, you undertook the most severe task one can be called upon to perform. Because you demonstrated the fortitude, resourcefulness, and calm judgment necessary to carry out that task, we now look to you for leadership and example in further exalting our country in peace. Harry Truman, the White House. It's very cool. Very, very cool. So, yeah. But, you know, again, the whole issue of but you said that your father never talked about it afterwards, and it's interesting to know how he felt about it.
Yeah, I don't want to overtake you. But my father, he graduated college, Newark College of Engineering, with a degree in chemical engineering. And he was sent to Fort Dix in New Jersey, officer training. And while there, he was pulled out and put on a train and ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, not knowing why or where he was going, because at that time they were looking for engineers. And when they go to Santa Fe, Los Alamos, it was about 20 miles up the hill. It's just a winding road. So you go to Santa Fe, and it was, I think it's the address is 16 Palace Avenue.
1603, yeah,
Yes,
1603.
and this lady, McGibbon, Dorothy McGibbon, she was like the gatekeeper. She was secretary for Oppenheimer, and all the engineers, anybody who worked on the Manhattan Project, had to go through her. And so she would give them IDs and tell them which.
That's the first chapter of the book.
Okay. And so then they would take them up to. He had no idea at that time what he was, what he was in store for. So he went up in Los Alamos, and he ended up working on the bomb itself. He was in the explosive part of the bomb. The lens, without getting technical, but there's a lens. So the atoms come and they have to get to the center of the bomb at a certain precise time for the explosion to occur, and he worked on that. And he actually signed the bomb that was dropped at Hiroshima. So there were engineers that actually signed the bomb. And there's photos of that. So, and I have a picture when the bomb, the test bomb, because they didn't know if this was going to work or not. But when they went to Alamogordo, the Trinity site, he wasn't there, but he was 20 miles away. He took a picture, and I have a picture of the bomb, the test bomb.
Really?
Yeah. But there's another little side. He was going with my mother at the time, who was still in New Jersey. And with the Manhattan Project, there were a lot of companies like General Electric that were working on the project, but not knowing what the end result was. So my mother at that time was working for Westinghouse, and so she was a secretary, and she would get papers all the time that said Manhattan Project. Well, she had no idea my father was working on that, so she thought it was Manhattan, New York. So she didn't know until after the war that the papers that she was passing along and signing was from the Manhattan Project, because with my father, anybody who was working there, any letters were censored, but they were stamped Santa Fe. It was never Los Alamos.
And even that, in many cases, what happened is if you were a physicist at Princeton, say, or in Berkeley, your letter would go from Los Alamos to Santa Fe to your institution, and from the institution it was sent to your parents, say. Okay, your parents sent a letter back to Berkeley. Berkeley would send it to Santa Fe. Santa Fe would take it back to Los Alamos, so that people didn't even necessarily. The fact that she knew he was in Santa Fe is actually quite amazing, because for a lot of people, their families had no idea where they were in the United States at all. And so it was very, and the other thing is that basically you're talking about, DuPont was involved, a lot of, there were 600,000 people involved in the Manhattan Project during World War II. Los Alamos was actually the smaller area. There was Oak Ridge in Tennessee had about 75,000, and Hanford in Washington had tens of thousands. And then there were other places that were also involved. But to think that this project was kept secret. Truman, as vice president, didn't know about it until he became president. He was informed about this only after Roosevelt died. So that's how secret it was. And to think that 500,000 people were involved in it is really phenomenal. So yeah, it was.
But it was very secretive. But things got got out.
Right.
You know, there were spies.
Absolutely.
And
Spies at Los Alamos?
There were spies at
Yeah,
Los
yeah.
Alamos.
American
You know,
spies or
it
spies?
was-
Is American
They
spies
were
or
American.
spies?
No, they were not American. Well, and they may have been American, but the one that is best known is a German Jewish refugee who was spying for the Soviets.
That was in the movie,
It
right?
was a guy named Fuchs. F-U-C-H-S.
Right.
Yeah, it was in the movie.
And he's actually mentioned in the Oppenheimer movie. There's a thing where he's
Yeah.
assigned something. There's like he's got a line in there.
But my father was in the barracks with Greenglass, who was the brother of Ethel Rosenberg. You know, the Rosenbergs that got executed. So he was rooming with Greenglass, who was the one was giving secretive information to other people. And my father, the story was is that one day Greenglass asked my father to go with him to Albuquerque to see somebody, and my father, for some reason, didn't go. And it turned out that was a famous incident where Greenglass passed secretive information to the Russians.
Wow.
Little things.
Did he tell you that?
My cousin did, and my father had his first cousin was ready to be shipped to the Pacific, and my father knew he was a chemist. He graduated with a degree in chemistry, and my father was able to get him off the boat that was taking him to the Pacific to work with him up in Los Alamos. And it turned out that all the people on the boat the boat was torpedoed, and everybody died. So my father saved his life. So he got sent to Santa Fe, not knowing it. He got off the train, and my father was standing there. He had no idea that my father was involved in getting him to work on the project.
It's funny how some of these stories come out 80 years later. Like I read about Mo Berg, Catcher Was a Spy.
Yeah.
That was a very interesting book.
Yeah.
Great book.
And talking about Enrico Fermi, on weekends they would go skiing together.
Yeah.
Was Greenglass funneling through the Rosenbergs?
Yes. Yeah. And those,
And Rosenbergs were his family?
yeah.
They were
Ethel was
cousins?
they were brother and sister.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
And they're apparently one of their children now lives in Otis, by the way.
He had two sons
Right.
who were adopted after their parents were electrocuted.
Right.
And one lives up in Northampton.
They changed their name. They don't have the same last name.
It's
Miracle. They're Miracles.
Miracle. Yeah, he spoke and at the synagogue in Great Barrington.
One of them has an organization that protects children from.
Yeah.
Do you know? Yeah, it has a nonprofit that protects children.
It's Michael and Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Disadvantaged children.
Yeah. So it was very interesting.
So how old was your dad when he left Fort Dix and he didn't know where he was going? Was he
Probably,
still in his 20s?
20s.
Before he was a young man.
Yeah.
But you weren't alive yet. You
No.
didn't,
Well, I was born in 49. My sister was born in 46, right after the war. But he had the opportunity to continue working in. There's still an atomic energy facility there. So a lot of people that were working on the Manhattan Project were offered to stay, and my mother didn't want to leave her family in New Jersey to go to Stanford.
After the bomb was dropped, did your mother go through a period of remorse since she didn't really know what your dad was working on until it came out?
She never said anything about that. But the people, there was mixed emotions. I don't want to take anything away from your presentation.
No, that's fine.
But the engineers their task was to build the bomb. They had nothing to do with the decision to drop the bomb. So, and also they were afraid that the Germans were going to build a bomb too. So the Russians at that time were our allies. So they were afraid that the nuclear program was occurring in Germany. So really needed to get the bomb developed quickly.
So this really was a turning point. I mean, that's exactly right. The whole thing was really geared as to counter the expectation that the Germans were developing a bomb, and the guy who was at the head of the German effort was a colleague of Oppenheimer's and Fermi. I mean, they all knew each other because the atomic physics community was very small before the war. They met at the same conferences. Oppenheimer's family was a German Jewish family. He knew German. He had spent time in Europe. He had studied in Germany. He had taught in Holland. So these were all, it was a very international kind of community, and they also knew how brilliant he was. So they were very afraid when he took on, when he became a Nazi and was willing to work with the Nazis. And I think the real break came when after the Germans, the Nazis surrendered in May of 1945. And then what? And then I think for some people at Los Alamos, it was like, okay, I'm out of here. And then for others, it was like, no, we still need to deal with the Japanese. And there was also at that point a lot of suspicion about what was going to happen with the Soviets after the war. It was a very unhappy it was a very unstable friendship, I would say, with the Soviets. It was an alliance of necessity, but the degree to which the further development after May of 1945 had much more to do with fear of what would happen after the war than with the war itself. And so there's a lot of controversy. What was said at the time was that the bombs saved 1 million American lives. That would have, because the Japanese were known for their kamikaze willingness to die for their cause, and that it would have been very, very bloody. And I don't think a lot of historians can substantiate that number. I don't know where that number necessarily came from. Certainly, it saved lives on the Allied side. How many lives? Who knows? And the degree to which the bomb, I think Hiroshima was one thing, Nagasaki, there were two different kinds of bombs. One was a uranium bomb, and that one, they did that one on Hiroshima, and then the plutonium was on Nagasaki. And I think the idea was the one on Nagasaki was what was known as Fat Boy or Big Boy, and it was a much bigger bomb, and they weren't sure whether it would actually work. And even though that's what they tested at Trinidad, so they knew it could explode, but I think the delivery system of it was still very much up in the air. And so the question was, to what extent was Nagasaki, to see whether the thing worked? And more than, so that's all very debatable, and it really depends what historian you talk to and who you talk to, whether they felt that, Hiroshima wouldn't convince the Japanese, and therefore Nagasaki was also necessary. Or whether it was really much more about showing off to the Soviets and being able to say, we have two, we have two kinds and they both work. So that's that's kind
of that was one of the deciding factors of Truman of dropping the bomb, was because they were afraid that the Russians were going to swoop in.
This is absolutely true.
Yeah.
This is absolutely true. The idea was that the Soviets were going to move into Asia in the middle of August. They were planned to around the 15th, and that had happened at the was it Malta? The Malta. There was kind of what was decided in Malta, and the Americans and Truman actually heard that the Trinity test, that was in July, he heard that the Trinity test had succeeded. He was informed of that at Malta, when he was at Malta. And apparently his whole demeanor changed vis-a-vis the Soviets. He got much tougher on them because he said, we have a real weapon here. And the Americans did not want the Soviets to get any credit for defeating the Japanese, because then they could assert rights in Asia after the war. And they did not want them to have any ability to say, we helped defeat the Japanese, therefore we get to have a stronghold in Asia too. And that was why they moved it up to as early in August as possible, weather conditions allowing, to be able to finish this off before the Soviets had a chance to move in. That's absolutely correct.
Question. The relationship between General Groves and Oppenheimer.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Fat Man and Little Boy was a great movie. I don't know how accurate it was, but I wonder what their relationship actually was between Groves and.
Well, I don't know. I mean, we get a lot of that in the Oppenheimer movie, and that is, the Oppenheimer movie. I have to say, if you have read a lot about the history, I have to take my hat off to them, because they really crammed in all kinds of details that if you know, you get it, and if you don't, it's just like it passes over your head. Everything from the martinis to, the number of pregnancies that there were. There's one scene where Grove says, everybody's having babies here. Oppenheimer had to get an extra doctor because everybody was having babies. And they actually, this is another one of the things you asked what I had to leave out. There was actually a ditty that was written about Oppenheimer being told by Groves to stop all these scientists from having all these babies, and his writing back to him and saying there are certain things I can tell the scientists to do and certain things I can't, and then somebody wrote a whole ditty about it, and so their relationship. Look, Oppenheimer was considered suspect by a lot of the upper echelon in Washington. He had a socialist girlfriend. His brother had been associated with socialist communists. He didn't really get he didn't get the highest security clearance the whole time he was, because of his presumed socialist sympathies. And Groves, I think, really went to bat for him. So they were very different from each other, but I think Groves really thought he was the best guy for the job, and he was going to stand by him for that.
All the scientists are like in their 20s and early 30s.
Right, and they were crazy. I mean, Feynman liked to specialize in showing the security guys that he knew how to break into safes. They were supposed to put their papers away in a safe, and so Feynman would crack the safe just to show them that that this was all nonsense. And he was a character. His wife was in a sanatorium. She had tuberculosis, and they used to write letters that they had this kind of code between them. They would talk, I don't know, about ice cream cars or something like that. That was all their way of communicating. And the censors said, stop this nonsense. We know you're trying to get away from. So they were wild characters. He was particularly, but they were all, they were young, creative, very smart people, and they did what young, creative, very smart people do. So.
Did Oppenheimer really want to kill his professor?
I don't know. I mean, I know that's in the movie.
It's pretty out there.
Well, it's bleaker it's more oblique in American Prometheus. It's not entirely clear. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Did you hear from any, now that the book's, I know it's not been out that long, but did you hear from anybody who's, aside from Alan, whose family might have been at Los Alamos?
I heard from somebody whose family was at Oak Ridge. She wrote to me because she's writing a book that's coming out in a few years about her parents. So she got in touch. And what was very interesting about what she told me was that her parents were actually told what they were going to be doing, what he was going to be doing. Her father was a chemist, and he was recruited, told that they were going to be producing plutonium, which shocked me. But she said they knew exactly why they were going to Oak Ridge. I think that'll happen more and more. So I'm curious to see. This is wonderful when this happens. It's really exciting.
And you didn't know each other before?
No.
No.
So, any other questions? No. Great. So thank you very, very much for coming. If people want to, there are copies of the book if you want to buy it. The library has one copy, and it's available on Kindle Kindle Unlimited for free. Otherwise, it's $3.99 on Kindle, so it's pretty affordable.